Talking to Strangers. Talking to Strangers, What We Should Know About the People We Don't Know is a non-fiction book written by Malcolm Gladwell. In this book, Gladwell explores the challenges of understanding and interacting with strangers, drawing on a range of case studies from history, politics, and popular culture. He argues that our assumptions and biases can lead us to misunderstand and misinterpret the behavior of others, and suggests strategies for improving our ability to communicate and connect with people we don't know. Through his analysis of these case studies, Gladwell aims to shed light on the complexities of human interaction and encourage readers to approach interactions with strangers with greater curiosity and empathy. Introduction: Fidel Castro's Spy. In the introduction of Talking to Strangers, Gladwell introduces the story of Cuban spy Ana Montes, who managed to deceive the U.S. government for years before being caught. Montes had a seemingly unremarkable career as an analyst for the Defense Intelligence Agency, but in reality she was a highly skilled spy who had been working for the Cuban government for more than a decade. Gladwell uses Montes' story to illustrate the central question of the book: why is it so difficult for us to understand and interact with strangers? Montes was able to deceive the U.S. government for so long because she was able to exploit the assumptions and biases that people have when dealing with others. For example, people tend to default to truth, that is, they assume that others are telling the truth unless they have a reason to believe otherwise. Montes was able to exploit this tendency by being a skilled liar who was able to create a convincing persona. The story of Montes is just one example of how people can be deceived by strangers. Gladwell goes on to explore other cases where people's assumptions about others have led to misunderstandings, mistakes, and tragic consequences. Throughout the book, Gladwell examines the factors that make it so difficult for us to understand and communicate with strangers, and offers insights and advice for how we can do better. Chapter 1: Fool's Errand. Gladwell introduces the concept of default to truth, which is the idea that people tend to believe what others tell them unless they have a reason to doubt them. Gladwell argues that this tendency is rooted in our social nature, and that it is generally a useful way to navigate social interactions. However, Gladwell also notes that there are times when defaulting to truth can be a problem. For example, he discusses the case of CIA agent Aldrich Ames, who was able to spy for the Soviet Union for years because his colleagues and superiors assumed that he was trustworthy. They never had any reason to suspect that he was a spy, so they simply believed him when he told them that he was not. Gladwell argues that defaulting to truth can be a fool's errand when dealing with strangers, because we often lack the context and information we need to accurately assess their credibility. He cites a number of experiments and studies that demonstrate how easy it is to deceive others, and how difficult it can be to detect deception. Chapter 2: Default to Truth. Gladwell continues to explore the concept of default to truth in more detail. He argues that our tendency to believe what others tell us is not just a social instinct, but also a cognitive shortcut that helps us navigate the complexity of the world around us. Gladwell notes that defaulting to truth is especially important in situations where we have limited information or time to make decisions. For example, when we meet a stranger for the first time, we rely on their words and actions to form an initial impression of them. We assume that they are telling the truth unless we have a reason to doubt them, because it would take too much time and effort to verify every statement they make. However, Gladwell also points out that defaulting to truth can be a problem when we encounter people who are motivated to deceive us. He cites examples like Bernie Madoff, who was able to perpetrate a massive financial fraud because his clients trusted him implicitly. Madoff's victims assumed that he was a reputable businessman who had their best interests at heart, so they did not question his investment strategies or ask for evidence of his claims. Chapter 3: Transparency. Gladwell explores the idea of transparency and how it affects our ability to understand and communicate with strangers. Gladwell begins the chapter by telling the story of a young woman named Sandra Bland, who was pulled over by a police officer for a minor traffic violation and ended up being arrested and later found dead in her cell. Gladwell argues that the incident was a result of a failure of transparency, where both Bland and the police officer were unable to understand each other's intentions and actions. Gladwell then goes on to discuss the concept of coupling, which refers to the idea that behavior is often linked to specific contexts or situations. For example, people may behave differently in a formal interview setting than they would in a casual conversation with friends. Gladwell argues that transparency is difficult to achieve because people's behavior is often coupled to specific contexts, and it can be difficult to understand someone's behavior without understanding the context in which it occurs. Gladwell also discusses the idea of defaulting to transparency, which is the opposite of defaulting to truth. Defaulting to transparency means assuming that people's behavior is a direct reflection of their underlying character or personality. Gladwell argues that defaulting to transparency can be just as problematic as defaulting to truth, because it can lead us to misjudge people based on incomplete or misleading information. Chapter 4: The Holy Fool. In Chapter 4 of Talking to Strangers, Gladwell introduces the concept of the holy fool, which is a person who behaves in unconventional or unpredictable ways that challenge the norms and conventions of their society. Gladwell argues that holy fools can be difficult to understand and communicate with, because their behavior is often at odds with our expectations and assumptions. Gladwell uses the example of the spy and double agent, Ana Montes, to illustrate the idea of the holy fool. Montes was a high-ranking intelligence officer for the U.S. government who was secretly working for the Cuban government. Despite her conspicuous behavior and suspicious activities, her colleagues and superiors assumed that she was simply an eccentric and unconventional individual, rather than a spy. Gladwell argues that holy fools can be particularly dangerous because they are able to exploit our assumptions and blind spots. Their unconventional behavior can cause us to lower our guard and make us more vulnerable to deception and manipulation. However, Gladwell also notes that holy fools can be a valuable asset in certain contexts, particularly in situations where the existing social order is corrupt or dysfunctional. Holy fools can challenge the status quo and offer a fresh perspective that can help bring about positive change. Chapter 5: Case Study: The Boy in the Shower. In Chapter 5 of Talking to Strangers, Gladwell presents a case study of the sexual abuse scandal at Penn State University, known as the Jerry Sandusky scandal. The scandal involved the former Penn State assistant football coach, Jerry Sandusky, who was accused of sexually abusing several young boys over a period of several years. Gladwell argues that the scandal was a result of a default-to-truth mentality, where people are inclined to believe that others are telling the truth unless there is evidence to the contrary. In the case of the Sandusky scandal, many people who had suspicions about Sandusky's behavior did not report them to the authorities because they assumed that he was a good and trustworthy person. Gladwell uses the example of a young boy, known as Victim 2, who was seen in the shower with Sandusky by a university employee, Mike McQuarrie. McQuarrie reported the incident to his superiors, but they did not take any action to stop Sandusky's abuse. Gladwell argues that the reason for this inaction was a failure of communication, where McQuarrie's report was not properly understood or taken seriously by his superiors. Gladwell also discusses the concept of transparency and how it can be difficult to achieve in situations where there is a power imbalance or where people are reluctant to challenge authority. In the case of the Sandusky scandal, the culture of Penn State football and the power dynamics within the university made it difficult for people to speak out against Sandusky's behavior. Chapter 6: Case Study: The Fraternity Party. In Chapter 6 of Talking to Strangers, Gladwell presents a case study of the sexual assault of a young woman, known as Marie, at a fraternity party in Washington State. The chapter explores how the concept of coupling can help us better understand the dynamics of sexual assault. Gladwell argues that sexual assault is often a result of a combination of factors, including individual behavior, cultural norms, and situational context. In the case of Marie, Gladwell suggests that her behavior at the party, e.g. drinking alcohol, flirting with multiple men, made her a target for sexual assault. However, Gladwell also emphasizes that Marie's behavior should not be used to excuse or justify the assault, and that the responsibility for the assault lies solely with the perpetrator. Gladwell also discusses the concept of coupling, which refers to the way that behavior and context can become intertwined in a way that makes certain outcomes more likely. For example, in the case of the fraternity party, the combination of alcohol, music, and a crowded environment created a context in which sexual assault was more likely to occur. Gladwell suggests that understanding the concept of coupling can help us identify and address situations where sexual assault is more likely to occur. Overall, Chapter 6 emphasizes the importance of recognizing the role that context and environment play in instances of sexual assault, and suggests that we need to focus on changing the underlying cultural norms and contextual factors that contribute to sexual assault. Gladwell also suggests that we need to be more willing to challenge these norms and speak out against instances of sexual assault, even in situations where it may be difficult or uncomfortable to do so. Chapter 7, Case Study, The Psychiatrist and the Army Ranger. Gladwell presents a case study of the relationship between a psychiatrist named Nidal Hassan and an Army Ranger named James E. Yeager. Hassan is known for committing a mass shooting at Fort Hood in Texas in 2009, while Yeager was one of the first responders to the shooting. Gladwell explores how the concept of mismatch can help us better understand the tragic events at Fort Hood. Mismatch refers to a situation where two people or groups have different expectations or assumptions about each other, and these differences can lead to misunderstandings, miscommunications, and even conflict. In the case of Hassan and Yeager, Gladwell suggests that there was a fundamental mismatch in the way that the military and psychiatry communities approached the issue of mental health. The military emphasized toughness, resilience, and the ability to push through stress and trauma, while psychiatry emphasized vulnerability, empathy, and the importance of addressing emotional issues. Hassan, who was both a psychiatrist and a member of the military, seemed to struggle with this mismatch and ultimately became radicalized, leading to his attack on Fort Hood. Gladwell suggests that understanding the concept of mismatch can help us identify and address situations where miscommunications and conflicts are likely to occur. He also emphasizes the importance of recognizing and addressing the underlying cultural norms and assumptions that can lead to mismatch in the first place. Overall, Chapter 7 provides a thought-provoking analysis of the tragic events at Fort Hood and highlights the importance of understanding and addressing the ways in which different communities and cultures can clash with each other. Chapter 8, Case Study, The Judges. In Chapter 8, Gladwell presents a case study of judges and their decision-making processes. He argues that understanding how judges make decisions can help us better understand the limitations of human judgment and the ways in which our biases can influence our perceptions. Gladwell starts by introducing the concept of default to the law, which refers to the idea that judges often default to the law when making decisions, even when the law is flawed or imperfect. He presents several examples of cases where judges followed the law even when it led to unjust outcomes, such as the case of Caliph Browder, a young man who was imprisoned for 3 years without trial. Gladwell then introduces the concept of transparency, which refers to the degree to which a judge's decisions are influenced by external factors, such as the time of day, the weather, or the outcome of previous cases. He presents several studies that demonstrate how these factors can influence judges' decisions, even when they are not consciously aware of them. Gladwell also discusses the impact of bias on judges' decisions, highlighting several studies that demonstrate how unconscious biases can influence our perceptions and judgments. He argues that judges are not immune to these biases and that they can have a significant impact on their decision-making processes. Overall, Chapter 8 emphasizes the importance of understanding the limitations of human judgment, particularly in the context of the legal system. Gladwell suggests that we need to be more aware of the ways in which our biases can influence our perceptions and judgments and work to address these biases in order to create a more just and equitable society. Chapter 9, Case Study, Sylvia Plath. In Chapter 9, Gladwell presents a case study of the poet Sylvia Plath and her struggle with mental illness. Plath is known for her poetry, including her autobiographical novel The Bell Jar, which depicts her own experience with depression and suicidal thoughts. Gladwell explores the concept of coupling, which refers to the idea that certain situations or contexts can trigger specific behaviors or emotions. He suggests that understanding coupling is crucial to understanding Plath's life and work. Gladwell discusses how Plath's experiences with depression and suicide were coupled with certain events and situations in her life, such as the death of her father, her marriage to fellow poet Ted Hughes, and her struggles with writer's block. He argues that understanding these couplings can help us better understand the complex factors that contributed to Plath's mental illness and ultimately her death. Gladwell also explores the role of language in shaping our perceptions of mental illness. He suggests that the way we talk about mental illness can influence how we perceive and treat it, and that our current language around mental illness may be inadequate or even harmful. He suggests that we need to develop new ways of talking about mental illness that reflect its complexity and nuance. Overall, Chapter 9 provides a nuanced and thought-provoking analysis of the life and work of Sylvia Plath, and highlights the importance of understanding the complex factors that contribute to mental illness. Chapter 10, Case Study, the CIA Analysts. In Chapter 10, Gladwell presents a case study of CIA analysts and their role in the run-up to the Iraq War. He argues that the failure of the CIA to accurately assess the situation in Iraq is an example of how difficult it can be to understand the motivations and intentions of other people, even when you have access to a lot of information. Gladwell explores the concept of coupling again in this chapter, but in the context of intelligence analysis. He suggests that intelligence analysts are often coupled to the information they receive, and that this coupling can lead to biases and blind spots that make it difficult to accurately assess a situation. Gladwell also discusses the impact of culture on intelligence analysis, highlighting the ways in which cultural differences can influence how information is interpreted and understood. He argues that understanding these cultural differences is crucial to understanding the motivations and intentions of other people. Overall, Chapter 10 provides a critical analysis of the role of intelligence analysis in the lead-up to the Iraq War, and highlights the limitations of human understanding and the challenges of interpreting complex information. Chapter 11, Case Study, Neville Chamberlain. In Chapter 11 of Talking to Strangers, Gladwell presents a case study of Neville Chamberlain and his policy of appeasement towards Nazi Germany in the lead-up to World War II. He argues that Chamberlain's failure to understand the true intentions of Adolf Hitler is an example of the challenges of understanding the motivations and intentions of other people. Gladwell explores the concept of default to truth again in this chapter, suggesting that Chamberlain's default to truth about Hitler's intentions led to his policy of appeasement. He argues that Chamberlain's belief that Hitler was a rational actor who could be reasoned with was a result of his default to truth, and that this default prevented him from seeing the true danger of Nazi Germany. Gladwell also discusses the impact of cultural differences on understanding the motivations and intentions of other people, highlighting the ways in which cultural differences can make it difficult to accurately interpret the actions of others. He argues that understanding these cultural differences is crucial to understanding the true intentions of other people. Overall, Chapter 11 provides a critical analysis of Neville Chamberlain's policy of appeasement towards Nazi Germany, and highlights the challenges of understanding the motivations and intentions of other people, particularly in the context of cultural differences. Conclusion, Coupling. In the conclusion of Talking to Strangers, Gladwell summarizes the key concepts and themes of the book, including the challenges of understanding the motivations and intentions of other people, the importance of cultural differences in shaping our perceptions of others, and the impact of coupling on our behavior and decision-making. Gladwell argues that we often default to truth when interacting with strangers, assuming that people are telling the truth and that their behavior is rational and predictable. However, he suggests that this default can be dangerous, as it can lead us to overlook important cues and signals that might suggest otherwise. Gladwell also emphasizes the importance of understanding cultural differences when interacting with strangers, arguing that our cultural backgrounds can shape our perceptions of others and influence our behavior and decision-making. Finally, Gladwell suggests that the concept of coupling is crucial to understanding human behavior and decision-making. He argues that understanding the specific contexts and situations in which people behave a certain way is essential to understanding why they behave that way, and that identifying and addressing these contexts can help us to avoid errors and misunderstandings.